Last Christmas Eve, my mother screamed at me in front of 20 relatives that I had destroyed their perfect family. I walked out into the December rain with nothing but my car keys and the sound of my nephew crying behind me. But 3 weeks later, when my brother's Admiral friend asked to speak with Fleet Admiral Rodriguez, everything changed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The smell of cinnamon and pine filled every corner of the Rodriguez family home on Maple Grove Drive, but underneath the holiday warmth, tension simmered like a pot about to boil over. I stood in the kitchen doorway, watching my mother Patricia arrange and rearrange the same batch of sugar cookies for the third time, her movements sharp and deliberate. Every December 24th for the past 15 years had followed the exact same script. Extended family would arrive at 4, dinner would be served at 6, and by 8 o'clock someone would mention how proud they were of David's latest achievement while I faded into the background like wallpaper. This year felt different, though. Maybe it was the way my father Michael kept glancing at me over his newspaper, or how my sister-in-law Jennifer had barely acknowledged my arrival 2 hours ago. I'd driven down from my studio apartment above Chen's bakery, the same cramped space I'd called home since leaving the Navy 18 months earlier. The drive from Riverside to my childhood neighborhood always felt like traveling backward through time, each familiar street corner reminding me of the person I used to be before 6 years of military service taught me who I could become. David's booming laugh echoed from the living room where he held court with his law school buddy, Admiral James Harrison. They'd been college roommates at UCLA before taking drastically different paths. David chose law school and a comfortable partnership in a downtown firm, while James dedicated his life to naval service, rising through the ranks with the kind of determination that earned respect in both military and civilian circles. I'd heard David mention his friend's promotion to Admiral several times over the past year, always with a mixture of pride and something else I couldn't quite identify. Competition, maybe, or the subtle need to prove that his civilian success measured equally against military achievement. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here was David bragging about his friend's naval career to a room full of relatives who had spent years suggesting my own military service was a phase, a detour from real life, something to overcome rather than celebrate. When I'd enlisted 6 years ago, the family's response had been polite disappointment wrapped in forced support. They'd attended my graduation from boot camp with the same enthusiasm they might show for a distant cousin's wedding, necessary but not particularly meaningful. I smoothed down my sweater and joined the crowd in the living room, settling into the corner chair that had become my traditional spot during family gatherings. From here I could observe without being expected to contribute much to conversations that rarely included topics I knew anything about. Legal cases, real estate investments, private school tuition costs, vacation plans to places I couldn't afford. The rhythm of family interaction flowed around me like water around a stone. Admiral Harrison commanded attention without effort, his posture straight even in casual clothes, his voice carrying the authority that came from years of making decisions that affected thousands of people. He was younger than I'd expected, probably early 40s, with graying temples and laugh lines that suggested he balanced military seriousness with genuine warmth. When he spoke about naval operations in the Pacific, or logistics challenges in modern warfare, his passion was evident. This wasn't someone who'd chosen military service as a backup plan. This was someone who understood that serving something larger than yourself could be the most fulfilling path possible. David dominated the conversation with stories from his law practice, each anecdote carefully crafted to highlight his own brilliance or the impressive settlement he'd negotiated. The family hung on every word, as they always did. My nephew Lucas climbed onto my lap, and I helped him with a puzzle while half listening to discussions about holiday bonuses and partnership opportunities. Sophia, my 8-year-old niece, showed me her latest art project, a watercolor painting of a Christmas tree that she'd worked on all week. As the afternoon progressed, more relatives arrived carrying covered dishes and wrapped gifts. The house filled with the sounds of multiple conversations, children playing, and the constant background noise of holiday preparations. I helped where I could, setting tables, organizing coats, keeping the younger kids entertained while adults caught up on a year's worth of news. It was easier to stay busy than to field questions about my job situation or living arrangements, topics that inevitably led to concerned looks and suggestions about getting my life together. My current employment situation was complicated in ways I preferred not to explain to relatives who measured success in salary figures and job titles. Since leaving the Navy, I'd cobbled together income from 3 part-time positions. Morning shifts at Frank's Diner provided steady, if modest, income and free meals. 2 evenings a week, I taught financial literacy classes at the Riverside Community Center, helping veterans and their families navigate civilian financial challenges. The work paid almost nothing but felt more meaningful than anything I'd done since leaving active duty. Weekends, I handled bookkeeping for several small businesses, using skills I'd developed managing supply budgets and procurement processes during my military service. The combination covered my basic expenses and allowed me to save small amounts each month, but it didn't translate into the kind of success story my family understood. David's law practice generated 6 figures annually. His house in the hills featured a pool, a 3-car garage, and enough space for Jennifer to host book club meetings and dinner parties. Their children attended private schools and took piano lessons, spoke about summer camps, and family trips to Hawaii. Meanwhile, I lived above a bakery in a studio apartment where the smell of fresh bread served as my alarm clock each morning. Mrs. Chen, my landlord, had become something of a surrogate grandmother, checking on me during difficult weeks and sharing dim sum on Sunday mornings. The arrangement worked for both of us. She appreciated having someone reliable upstairs who could sign for deliveries and keep an eye on the shop after hours. I valued the independence and the community of Pine Street, where small business owners looked out for each other and success was measured in relationships rather than bank statements. The disconnect between my family's expectations and my reality had grown wider over the past year. Every gathering included subtle suggestions about returning to school, applying for better jobs, or finding a nice man to settle down with. The underlying message was always the same. Military service had been a temporary adventure, but now it was time to grow up and pursue conventional success. The skills I'd developed during 6 years in the Navy, the leadership experience, the ability to manage complex logistics under pressure, none of that translated into family conversations about career advancement. When dinner was called, I automatically moved toward the kitchen to help serve, as I had for every family gathering since childhood. Jennifer was already there, arranging serving spoons and coordinating the timing of various dishes. She handed me a stack of dinner plates without making eye contact, her interactions with me limited to necessary coordination. Over the years, our relationship had evolved from polite friendliness to cool efficiency. She wasn't hostile, exactly, but she'd clearly aligned herself with the family narrative that positioned David as the success story and me as the work in progress. The dining room table had been extended with 2 additional leaves to accommodate everyone, creating a long rectangle that emphasized the hierarchy of seating arrangements. David and Jennifer sat near my parents, Admiral Harrison positioned as the guest of honor to my father's right. Children were relegated to a smaller table in the adjoining breakfast nook, while I found myself at the far end of the main table, next to elderly Aunt Rosa, who was mostly deaf, and my cousin Mark, who spent most of dinner checking his phone. The conversation flowed around topics of mutual interest among the core family members. David described his latest high-profile case, carefully omitting details that might violate client confidentiality while ensuring everyone understood the significance of his role. Jennifer discussed Sophia's acceptance into an accelerated math program and Lucas's progress in youth soccer. My parents shared updates about their retirement activities, volunteer work at the church, and plans for a cruise next spring. Admiral Harrison proved to be an engaging dinner companion, asking thoughtful questions about everyone's activities and sharing appropriately edited stories from his naval service. He spoke about the challenges of modern military logistics, the complexity of coordinating operations across multiple time zones, and the importance of developing systems that could adapt to rapidly changing conditions. His respect for the men and women under his command was evident in every anecdote, and his understanding of military life went far beyond the surface-level patriotism that most civilians expressed. As the evening progressed, the traditional gift exchange approached. This ritual had evolved over the years into something that felt more like a performance than a celebration. Each gift opening was accompanied by effusive praise for the giver's thoughtfulness and the recipient's deserving nature. David and Jennifer's presents were always the most elaborate, carefully chosen items that demonstrated both their financial success and their attention to relationships. This year, they'd gotten my parents a weekend getaway to a luxury resort, complete with spa treatments and fine dining reservations. My own gift-giving had become an exercise in careful budgeting and creative thinking. I'd found vintage books for my parents, thoughtfully selected titles related to their interests in gardening and local history. For David's family, I'd made gift baskets with specialty items from local artisans, products I'd discovered through my work at the community center, and connections with small business owners. The gifts were meaningful but modest, reflecting both my financial limitations and my preference for supporting local creators over major retailers. When my turn came to open presents, the family's attention felt polite rather than engaged. I unwrapped a gift card from my parents, practical and impersonal, and a scented candle set from David and Jennifer that felt like something they'd grabbed at the last minute. The children had made me drawings, which I treasured far more than the adult gifts, and I made sure to give them the enthusiastic response their effort deserved. The evening continued with coffee and dessert, more conversation, and the gradual winding down that marked the end of family gatherings. Children grew tired and cranky, adults began discussing departure times, and the energy that had filled the house for hours slowly dissipated. I helped clear dishes and pack leftovers, making myself useful while conversations shifted to logistics and planning. It was during this cleanup phase that the first crack appeared in the evening's facade. Jennifer made a comment about the gift card my parents had given me, suggesting it would help with groceries or other necessities. The implication was clear. I needed financial assistance for basic survival, while everyone else exchanged luxury items and experiences. The comment wasn't meant to be cruel, but it highlighted the economic disparity that had become an uncomfortable reality for family gatherings. David overheard and felt compelled to add his perspective. He mentioned a job opening at his firm, some entry-level position that might suit someone with my background, assuming I was interested in starting over in a field where I had no experience or particular interest. The suggestion was well-intentioned but revealed how little he understood about my skills, interests, or career goals. In his mind, any job with a steady salary and conventional benefits would be an improvement over my current situation. The conversation attracted attention from other family members, and suddenly, everyone had advice about my career prospects. Someone mentioned a cousin who'd found success in pharmaceutical sales. Another relative suggested looking into government positions. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. That might value military experience. The discussion took on the tone of an intervention, with multiple voices offering solutions to a problem I hadn't asked for help solving. I found myself in the familiar position of being discussed rather than consulted, as if my presence was optional for conversations about my own life. The advice was genuine and meant to be helpful, but it reinforced the family's perception that my current path was clearly unsuccessful and needed correction. No one asked about my satisfaction with my work, my future plans, or whether I might have insights into my own situation that they lacked. Admiral Harrison listened to this exchange with growing interest, occasionally asking questions about my background that revealed a different perspective on military service and its value in civilian careers. When someone mentioned that I'd been in the Navy, he turned toward me with renewed attention, asking about my rate and where I'd served. The questions were casual but informed, the kind of inquiry one service member makes to another. I answered briefly, mentioning my specialization in logistics and supply chain management, my duty stations, and the duration of my service. Admiral Harrison nodded with recognition, his expression shifting subtly as he processed information that clearly meant more to him than it did to my family members. He asked follow-up questions about specific operations and challenges, demonstrating knowledge of the systems and processes I'd worked with during my naval career. The conversation might have developed further, but my mother chose that moment to redirect attention toward what she considered more important topics. She began discussing plans for next year's Christmas gathering, potential venue changes, and the logistics of coordinating everyone's schedules. The shift was deliberate, moving away from topics that highlighted my military experience toward family matters that positioned David and Jennifer as the central figures in ongoing traditions. As the evening wound down and relatives began their departures, I helped with final cleanup while mentally preparing for my own exit. The drive back to my apartment would give me time to process the familiar mixture of love and frustration that family gatherings generated. I cared deeply about these people, but I'd never found a way to bridge the gap between their expectations and my reality. Admiral Harrison approached me while I was loading dishwasher, coffee cup in hand, and a thoughtful expression on his face. He'd clearly been considering our earlier conversation about naval service, and something about my responses had prompted additional questions. He asked about my specific role in logistics operations, whether I'd worked with fleet supply systems, and what level of responsibility I'd held for procurement and distribution decisions. His questions were detailed and specific, revealing knowledge that went far beyond casual interest in military service. This wasn't someone making polite conversation about supporting the troops. This was a professional discussion between people who understood the complexity and importance of naval logistics operations. I found myself explaining aspects of my work that I'd never discussed with my family, technical details about supply chain management and budget oversight that had been central to my daily responsibilities for 6 years. The conversation was interrupted by my mother's announcement that it was time for the traditional family photo, an annual ritual that documented the year's gathering and provided content for next year's Christmas cards. Everyone gathered in the living room, arranging themselves according to height and family groupings, while my father adjusted camera settings and lighting. I automatically moved toward the back of the group, my usual position in family photos, but my mother had other ideas this year. She suggested I step out to take the picture instead, offering to show me how to operate my father's new digital camera. The suggestion was presented as helpfulness, giving me something useful to do, but the message was unmistakable. The family photo would look better without me in it. The moment crystallized something that had been building all evening, all year, possibly all my life. I wasn't being included in the family narrative so much as tolerated on its margins. My military service, my current work, my entire adult life, existed outside the story my family told about itself. I was the difficult chapter they preferred to skip when sharing their success with others. I declined to take the photo, suggesting they use the camera's timer function instead, and excused myself to gather my coat and purse. The evening had reached its natural conclusion, and extending my stay would only create additional opportunities for uncomfortable interactions. Admiral Harrison watched this exchange with obvious interest, his expression suggesting he was processing dynamics that went beyond the immediate conversation. As I prepared to leave, my mother followed me to the front door, ostensibly to say goodbye, but really to deliver one final message about my choices and their impact on the family's harmony. Her words were carefully chosen but unmistakably critical, expressing disappointment in my career decisions, my living situation, and my apparent inability to appreciate the opportunities and support the family had provided over the years. The confrontation that followed would change everything, but in that moment, standing in the foyer while Christmas music played softly in the background and my family posed for their perfect photo, I had no idea that Admiral Harrison was listening to every word. The words my mother spoke in the foyer that Christmas Eve cut deeper than any criticism she'd delivered during my childhood. Her voice remained controlled, barely above a whisper, but each syllable carried the weight of years of accumulated disappointment. She spoke about embarrassment, about having to explain my situation to friends and extended family, about the contrast between David's achievements and my apparent inability to establish a meaningful career or stable relationship. What stung most wasn't the content of her criticism, but the timing and location. She'd chosen this moment, while our relatives gathered in the living room for their annual photo, while Christmas music created a soundtrack of forced joy, to deliver a comprehensive indictment of my adult choices. The message was clear. I was disrupting their perfect family narrative, simply by existing as I was. I listened without defending myself, a skill I developed during military service when receiving constructive criticism from superior officers. The difference was that military feedback focused on performance and improvement, while my mother's words seemed designed to express frustration rather than promote positive change. She spoke about wasted potential, about opportunities I'd thrown away by choosing military service over college, about the disappointment of watching me struggle financially while my younger brother flourished. The conversation attracted attention from the living room, where family members had begun to notice the absence of both my mother and me from their photo session. Jennifer appeared in the hallway, ostensibly checking on our delay, but clearly curious about the intense discussion taking place near the front door. Her presence seemed to embolden my mother, who raised her voice slightly and expanded her critique to include concerns about my influence on the children. According to my mother, Sophia and Lucas were beginning to ask questions about why their aunt lived differently than their parents, why I worked multiple jobs instead of having a career, why I drove an older car and lived in such a small apartment. These questions apparently created uncomfortable conversations that disrupted the family's preferred narrative about success and achievement. My very existence as an alternative path was somehow undermining their efforts to instill proper values in the next generation. David joined us in the foyer, his expression mixing concern with irritation at having their photo session interrupted. He'd overheard enough of the conversation to understand the general topic, and his immediate response was to suggest we continue this discussion at a more appropriate time. His tone carried the authority he used in legal settings, calm, but unmistakably directive. He wanted the uncomfortable conversation to end so the evening could return to its planned script. But my mother wasn't finished. Years of polite restraint seemed to crumble, as she voiced frustrations that had apparently been building since my return from military service. She spoke about the strain my situation placed on family gatherings, how my obvious financial struggles created an awkward dynamic that affected everyone's enjoyment of these occasions. She mentioned specific incidents where relatives had asked about my circumstances, forcing her to deflect questions or provide explanations that highlighted my apparent lack of direction. The most devastating comment came when she suggested that my military service had been a selfish choice that disrupted family stability during crucial years. While David was building his law practice and starting his family, I'd been absent, unavailable for important milestones and family crises. My return had created expectations that I would quickly transition into civilian success, but instead I'd become a source of ongoing concern and disappointment. Jennifer nodded along with these observations, adding her own perspective about the confusion my lifestyle choices created for her children. She spoke about the difficulty of explaining why adults make different choices, why some people seem to struggle while others thrive, why their aunt lived so differently than their parents. Her comments revealed the extent to which my family viewed my current situation as a cautionary tale rather than simply a different approach to building a meaningful life. The criticism escalated when my mother mentioned specific examples of my apparent irresponsibility. She cited my decision to leave a stable military career without having a civilian job lined up, my choice to live in a studio apartment instead of finding a roommate or moving back home temporarily, my involvement in volunteer work that provided no financial benefit while I struggled to pay basic expenses. Each example was presented as evidence of poor judgment and misplaced priorities. David attempted to moderate the conversation by suggesting practical solutions to some of the issues my mother had raised. He offered to help me create a proper resume that emphasized transferable skills from military service, to make introductions with colleagues who might have suitable job openings, to provide references that could help me secure better employment. His suggestions were well-intentioned but reinforced the underlying assumption that my current path was clearly inadequate and needed correction. The discussion might have continued indefinitely, but Admiral Harrison's appearance in the hallway changed the dynamic completely. He'd apparently grown curious about our extended absence from the photo session and had come to investigate. His presence immediately altered the tone of the conversation, adding an external observer to what had been a private family confrontation. My mother's demeanor shifted subtly, her criticism becoming more measured and diplomatic in front of a guest. Admiral Harrison's arrival also provided me with an unexpected opportunity to extract myself from the increasingly uncomfortable situation. I thanked my family for the evening, wished everyone a Merry Christmas, and moved toward the door with my coat and purse. The abrupt ending to the conversation left several issues unresolved, but continuing the discussion would only lead to more painful revelations about how my family truly viewed my choices and circumstances. As I reached for the door handle, my mother delivered her final statement, the words that would echo in my mind for weeks afterward. She declared that I had systematically destroyed their perfect family dynamic, that my inability to achieve conventional success had created ongoing stress and embarrassment for everyone. According to her assessment, my very presence at family gatherings highlighted the contrast between success and failure, making it impossible for them to simply enjoy their achievements without being reminded of my struggles. The accusation was so comprehensive and devastating that I felt momentarily breathless, as if someone had knocked the wind out of me with a physical blow. This wasn't criticism of specific choices or suggestions for improvement. This was a fundamental rejection of who I had become, a declaration that my existence as I was caused them genuine pain and disruption. I was being told that my family's happiness required my absence or transformation into someone completely different. Admiral Harrison witnessed this final exchange with obvious discomfort, his expression revealing both surprise at my mother's harsh words and sympathy for my position. He stepped forward slightly, as if considering whether to intervene in a family dispute, but I shook my head almost imperceptibly. This wasn't his battle to fight, and military training had taught me when tactical retreat was the appropriate response to an unwinnable situation. I left the house without responding to my mother's accusation, walking into the December evening while the sounds of continued family celebration drifted through the windows behind me. The contrast was stark. Inside, my relatives were enjoying Christmas Eve traditions, taking photos, sharing dessert, and creating memories they would treasure. Outside, I stood alone in the cold, processing the reality that my participation in these gatherings was apparently more burden than blessing for the people I loved most. The drive back to my apartment provided time to process what had happened, but the shock of such direct rejection made coherent thought difficult. I'd known for years that my family was disappointed in my choices, but I'd assumed their love and acceptance remained constant, even if they disagreed with my decisions. The conversation in the foyer had revealed something more fundamental. My current life was so far from their expectations that it caused them genuine distress. I parked behind Chen's bakery and climbed the exterior stairs to my studio apartment, grateful for the privacy and quiet after hours of family interaction. The small space felt peaceful rather than cramped, offering refuge from the emotional intensity of the evening. I made tea and sat by my single window, looking out at Pine Street where a few other businesses still displayed holiday lights. The modest decorations seemed more authentic than the elaborate displays in my family's neighborhood. Simpler, but somehow more genuine. Sleep came fitfully that night, interrupted by replaying conversations and analyzing every interaction from the evening. I found myself wondering whether my mother's assessment was accurate, whether my choices had indeed caused the family genuine harm, whether my presence at gatherings created the kind of discomfort she'd described. The possibility that I was unknowingly damaging relationships I valued deeply was more painful than any criticism of my career or financial situation. Christmas Day passed quietly in my apartment, a deliberate contrast to the traditional family gathering I would normally have attended. I'd been expected at my parents' house for brunch and gift opening, but the previous evening's confrontation made participation impossible. Instead, I spent the morning reading, the afternoon volunteering at a local shelter that served Christmas dinner to homeless veterans, and the evening reflecting on the year's events and considering what changes might be necessary going forward. The volunteer work at the shelter provided perspective that helped balance the previous evening's emotional turmoil. Here were men and women who had served their country with distinction, who had developed valuable skills and demonstrated courage under pressure, but who now struggled with challenges that civilian society often failed to understand or address adequately. Their stories reminded me that success couldn't be measured solely in financial terms or conventional achievements. Working alongside other volunteers, I found myself in conversations about military service, transition challenges, and the difficulty of translating combat experience into civilian career opportunities. Several veterans mentioned feeling disconnected from family members who couldn't understand their military background or appreciate the skills they developed during service. The parallels to my own situation were obvious, though my family's rejection was based on disappointment rather than incomprehension. When I returned to my apartment that evening, I found 17 missed calls and 12 voicemail messages from various family members. The volume of communication suggested that my absence from Christmas Day activities had created more disruption than I'd anticipated. I listened to the messages in chronological order, tracking the evolution from concern through confusion to frustration, as family members realized I wouldn't be participating in their traditional celebration. The early messages were from my father, asking about my whereabouts and expressing concern about my well-being after the previous evening's difficult conversation. His tone was gentle, suggesting worry rather than anger, and he offered to pick me up or meet somewhere neutral if I preferred not to return to the family home immediately. These calls revealed a perspective I hadn't anticipated. He viewed the confrontation as regrettable, but not relationship ending. Later messages came from David, his voice carrying the measured tone he used for conflict resolution in his legal practice. He acknowledged that emotions had run high the previous evening and suggested that family discussions would be more productive after everyone had time to cool down. He proposed a private conversation between the two of us, away from the larger family dynamic, to address concerns and identify solutions that might work for everyone involved. My mother's messages were more complex, combining continued criticism with expressions of concern about my emotional state and physical safety. She seemed genuinely worried that her harsh words might have prompted some kind of destructive response, but she also maintained that the fundamental issues she'd raised required attention and resolution. Her tone suggested she viewed the confrontation as necessary communication rather than emotional abuse. Jennifer's single message was brief and diplomatic, expressing hope that family relationships could be repaired and that future gatherings could be more comfortable for everyone. She avoided taking sides in the conflict but made it clear that my absence from Christmas Day activities had affected the children, who had asked repeatedly about my whereabouts and expressed disappointment about not seeing their aunt. The final message came from an unexpected source, Admiral Harrison. His voice was formal but warm, as he explained that David had provided my contact information because he wanted to follow up on our conversation about naval logistics. He mentioned being impressed by my background and experience, and he requested an opportunity to discuss potential career opportunities that might utilize my military skills more effectively than my current employment situation. This last message was puzzling for several reasons. Admiral Harrison barely knew me, our conversation at dinner had been brief and interrupted, and his interest in my career prospects seemed disproportionate to our limited interaction. Military officers of his rank typically didn't involve themselves in the employment challenges of random civilians they met at social gatherings. His call suggested either exceptional kindness or additional information that hadn't been apparent during our dinner conversation. I decided to return Admiral Harrison's call first, partly because his message was least emotionally charged, and partly because his perspective as an outsider to family dynamics might provide useful insights. When he answered, his tone was professional but friendly, and he immediately asked about my well-being after what he described as a difficult evening. His concern seemed genuine rather than polite, suggesting he'd been more affected by witnessing the family confrontation than I'd realized. Admiral Harrison explained that our brief conversation about naval logistics had prompted him to research my service record, a routine inquiry he sometimes made when meeting fellow veterans. What he discovered had surprised him significantly and motivated his follow-up call. According to his research, my military service had been far more distinguished than my family seemed to realize, with commendations and achievements that suggested exceptional competence in complex operational environments. He mentioned specific operations and assignments that appeared on my service record, details that demonstrated a level of responsibility and recognition that contradicted my family's perception of my military service as an extended adventure or phase I'd eventually outgrow. His questions revealed knowledge of my work that went far beyond what I'd shared during our dinner conversation, suggesting he'd conducted a thorough review of publicly available information about my naval career. The conversation took an unexpected turn when Admiral Harrison asked whether my family was aware of my military achievements and the level of responsibility I'd held during service. When I explained that they'd shown little interest in the details of my naval career, preferring to focus on my transition challenges and current employment situation, his response was a mixture of surprise and concern. He seemed genuinely puzzled by their failure to recognize or value the skills and experience I'd developed during 6 years of distinguished service. Admiral Harrison then made an offer that would fundamentally change my perspective on both my career prospects and my family relationships. He explained that his current command included oversight of naval logistics operations across multiple installations, work that required exactly the kind of expertise I'd developed during my service years. He was actively seeking qualified personnel to fill senior civilian positions that would utilize military experience while offering competitive compensation and opportunities for advancement. The specific opportunity he described was a logistics coordinator position based at Naval Base San Diego, managing supply chain operations for Pacific Fleet activities. The role would involve coordinating procurement, distribution, and inventory management across multiple vessels and installations, work that aligned perfectly with my military background and civilian interests. The salary he mentioned was more than double my current combined income from 3 part-time jobs, with benefits that included health insurance, retirement contributions, and opportunities for professional development. More importantly, Admiral Harrison explained that this position was part of a broader initiative to recruit experienced veterans into civilian roles that maximized their military training and leadership experience. Rather than expecting veterans to abandon their service background and start over in unrelated fields, this program specifically valued military skills and provided pathways for continued growth within familiar operational environments. The offer was both generous and surprising. But what struck me most was Admiral Harrison's clear respect for my military service, and his understanding of how those skills could translate into meaningful civilian work. This was the first time since leaving the Navy that someone had viewed my military background as an asset rather than an obstacle, a foundation for future success rather than a phase to overcome. Our conversation continued for nearly an hour, as Admiral Harrison outlined the details of the position, the application process, and the timeline for filling the role. He explained that my service record had already been reviewed by the selection committee, and formal interviews were mostly a procedural requirement given his strong recommendation. The opportunity represented not just employment but validation that my military service had genuine value in civilian professional settings. As we concluded the conversation, Admiral Harrison made an observation that would prove prophetic. He suggested that my family's inability to recognize my achievements and potential represented their limitations rather than my failures. According to his assessment, successful leaders learn to identify and develop talent, regardless of conventional credentials or traditional career paths. My family's narrow definition of success had prevented them from appreciating the exact qualities that made me valuable in professional environments. After ending the call, I sat in my apartment processing the implications of Admiral Harrison's offer and observations. Within 24 hours, my perspective on both my career prospects and family relationships had shifted dramatically. The opportunity at Naval Base San Diego represented a chance to build on my military experience, rather than abandon it, to find professional fulfillment that aligned with my skills and interests, rather than settling for whatever employment I could find locally. More significantly, Admiral Harrison's recognition of my military achievements provided external validation that contradicted my family's assessment of my choices and capabilities. If a senior military officer viewed my service record as impressive and my skills as valuable, perhaps the problem wasn't my failure to achieve conventional success, but my family's inability to recognize alternative forms of achievement and contribution. The decision about whether to pursue the position in San Diego would require careful consideration of multiple factors, including the impact on family relationships and the challenge of relocating when I'd just begun to establish stability in Riverside. But for the first time since leaving the military, I felt genuinely optimistic about my professional future, and confident that my skills and experience had real value in environments where they were properly understood and appreciated. The week between Christmas and New Year's passed in a strange bubble of clarity and possibility. I submitted my application for the logistics coordinator position at Naval Base San Diego within 48 hours of Admiral Harrison's call, attaching documentation of my service record, civilian work experience, and recommendations from former commanding officers who remembered my contributions to fleet operations. The process felt familiar and professional, a stark contrast to the civilian job applications I'd submitted over the past 18 months that seemed to disappear into automated systems without acknowledgement. Frank Kowalski, the owner of the diner where I worked morning shifts, noticed the change in my demeanor immediately. During our usual slow period between breakfast and lunch rushes, he asked directly whether something significant had happened over the holiday weekend. Frank was a veteran himself, Army service in his younger years, and he'd always treated my military background with the respect that civilian employers often failed to demonstrate. His question wasn't casual curiosity, but genuine concern from someone who understood the challenges of military transition. I explained the situation carefully, describing the family confrontation and Admiral Harrison's unexpected offer, without revealing details that might seem like bragging or complaint. Frank listened with the patient attention he'd developed during decades of managing a business that served as an informal community center for local residents. His response surprised me with its directness and insight into dynamics I'd been too close to see clearly. According to Frank's assessment, my family's reaction to my military service and current situation reflected their own insecurity rather than any failure on my part. He'd observed similar patterns among customers whose families struggled to understand or appreciate military experience, particularly when service members returned with skills and perspectives that didn't translate easily into civilian success stories. The problem wasn't my choices, but their inability to recognize value that didn't conform to their expectations. Frank shared his own experience of family tension after military service, describing years of subtle criticism and suggestions that he abandon his dream of restaurant ownership in favor of more traditional employment. His family had viewed his decision to purchase the diner as risky and impractical, preferring that he use his GI benefits for college and pursue professional careers like his siblings. The success of his business over the past 30 years had gradually changed their perspective, but the initial lack of support had created lasting distance in family relationships. His advice was both practical and philosophical. He suggested that pursuing the opportunity in San Diego would provide professional fulfillment regardless of family approval, while demonstrating that alternative paths could lead to meaningful success. More importantly, he emphasized that seeking validation from people who couldn't appreciate my military service was ultimately futile and potentially destructive to my self-confidence and career development. The conversation with Frank prompted me to research the specific position and command structure at Naval Base San Diego more thoroughly. Admiral Harrison's description had been accurate but modest. The logistics coordinator role involved oversight of supply operations for one of the Navy's most strategically important installations, managing procurement and distribution for dozens of vessels and thousands of personnel. The position required exactly the kind of systems thinking and operational experience I'd developed during my naval service, but with expanded scope and increased responsibility. More significantly, the role was part of a broader Department of Defense initiative to recruit experienced veterans into civilian positions that maximized their military training. The program recognized that traditional corporate hiring practices often failed to identify or appropriately utilize the leadership and technical skills that service members developed during their military careers. By creating positions specifically designed for veterans, the program addressed both military transition challenges and operational needs within defense organizations. The salary and benefits package exceeded my expectations significantly. The base compensation was nearly 3 times my current income from multiple part-time jobs, with health insurance, retirement contributions, and opportunities for advancement that could lead to senior management positions within the defense logistics community. The financial security would allow me to pursue professional development, contribute to savings goals, and potentially help other veterans facing similar transition challenges. Beyond the immediate financial benefits, the position offered something I'd been missing since leaving active duty, a sense of purpose that aligned with my values and utilized my strongest capabilities. Working in naval logistics meant contributing to national defense, while helping ensure that service members had the resources and support they needed to accomplish their missions effectively. The work would be challenging and meaningful, requiring the same attention to detail and systematic approach that had characterized my military service. I spent hours reviewing job descriptions, organizational charts, and mission statements for the command structure I would be joining. The more I learned about the position and its broader context, the more convinced I became that this opportunity represented exactly the kind of career development I'd been seeking since leaving the military. The role would provide professional growth while honoring my service background rather than requiring me to abandon or minimize my military experience. 3 days after submitting my application, I received a call from the Human Resources Office at Naval Base San Diego requesting availability for a video interview with the selection committee. The timeline was accelerated due to operational needs, with interviews scheduled for the following week and position start date in early February. The quick progression suggested serious interest in my candidacy and confidence in Admiral Harrison's recommendation. Preparing for the interview required revisiting aspects of my military service that I'd rarely discussed since leaving active duty. I reviewed documentation of operations I'd supported, commendations I'd received, and leadership responsibilities I'd held during my 6 years in the Navy. The process of organizing this information reminded me of achievements and contributions I'd minimized or forgotten entirely during the challenging months of civilian job searching. One document particularly caught my attention: a commendation letter from my former commanding officer describing my role in developing improved procurement procedures that had saved the Navy millions of dollars while reducing delivery times for critical supplies. The letter detailed specific innovations I'd implemented and their measurable impact on operational efficiency. Reading it again after 18 months of civilian employment struggles, I felt a surge of pride and confidence I hadn't experienced since leaving military service. The commendation letter also included a paragraph about my leadership during a complex emergency resupply operation that had required coordinating resources across multiple time zones and competing priorities. The successful completion of that mission had directly supported combat operations and potentially saved lives, responsibility that far exceeded anything I'd encountered in civilian employment. Yet my family had never asked about such experiences, preferring to focus on my apparent failure to transition smoothly into conventional success. I called Mrs. Chen, my landlord, to discuss the possibility of relocating to San Diego if the position was offered. She was both supportive and disappointed, understanding my need for career advancement while recognizing that my departure would affect both her personal comfort and business operations. We agreed that I would provide maximum notice if the opportunity materialized, allowing time to find a suitable replacement tenant and transition my bookkeeping responsibilities to another local provider. The conversation with Mrs. Chen prompted broader reflection on the relationships and community connections I'd developed in Riverside. Despite financial challenges, I'd found genuine satisfaction in my volunteer work at the community center, my role in Frank's Diner, and my connections with local small business owners who valued reliability and competence over credentials and income levels. These relationships had provided support and validation during difficult months when family criticism made me question my worth and capabilities. Leaving Riverside would mean abandoning these connections and starting over in a new city, but it would also provide distance from family dynamics that had proven increasingly toxic to my self-confidence and emotional well-being. The geographic separation might actually improve family relationships by removing me from daily proximity to their disappointment, while allowing my professional success to speak for itself over time. The video interview took place on a Thursday morning, conducted from my apartment using borrowed equipment from the community center's computer lab. The selection committee included 3 senior personnel from the Logistics Command, including a retired Navy captain who had transitioned to civilian leadership within the defense contractor community. Their questions focused primarily on technical competence and leadership experience, areas where my military background provided extensive examples and demonstrated capabilities. The interview atmosphere was professional and respectful, with committee members clearly familiar with military service and appreciative of the skills that veterans brought to defense logistics operations. They asked detailed questions about specific challenges I'd faced during my naval service, solutions I'd developed, and lessons learned from both successful operations and occasional failures. The conversation felt more like a consultation between professionals than a traditional job interview. One committee member asked about my motivation for leaving active duty and my experience during civilian transition. I answered honestly about family pressure to return home and establish conventional career success, while acknowledging that the transition had proven more challenging than anticipated. Rather than viewing this struggle as weakness, the committee seemed to understand it as a common experience among veterans whose skills didn't translate easily into civilian employment markets. The interview concluded with detailed discussion of the position's responsibilities, reporting structure, and opportunities for professional development. The committee members emphasized that successful candidates would be expected to propose innovations and improvements to existing logistics processes, drawing on their military experience to enhance operational efficiency. This expectation aligned perfectly with my interests and capabilities, suggesting a role that would provide intellectual challenge as well as professional advancement. 2 days after the interview, Admiral Harrison called with unofficial confirmation that the position would be offered pending completion of background checks and security clearance updates. His tone conveyed both professional satisfaction and personal pleasure at having identified a strong candidate for an important role. He mentioned that the selection committee had been impressed by my technical knowledge and leadership experience, particularly my ability to articulate complex operational challenges and propose practical solutions. The background check process moved quickly due to my recent military service and existing security clearance, which remained active despite my civilian status. Within a week, I received formal offer documentation including salary details, benefits information, and expected start date in mid-February. The offer exceeded my expectations in every category, providing financial security and professional opportunity that surpassed anything I'd imagined possible when I left active duty. Accepting the position required careful consideration of timing and logistics. I needed to provide appropriate notice to my current employers, arrange for relocation to San Diego, and manage the transition away from community commitments in Riverside. More importantly, I needed to decide how and when to inform my family about this development, recognizing that their response would likely range from surprise to skepticism about my ability to succeed in such a responsible position. I submitted my formal acceptance on a Friday afternoon, officially committing to begin work at Naval Base San Diego in 6 weeks. The decision felt both momentous and natural, representing validation of my military service and confidence in my professional capabilities. For the first time since leaving active duty, I felt genuinely optimistic about my career prospects and excited about contributing to meaningful work that utilized my strongest skills. Frank was the first person I told about the position, sharing the news during our usual slow period at the diner. His response was immediate enthusiasm mixed with understanding about the challenges of relocation and career transition. He offered to provide references for future opportunities and to serve as a contact for other veterans facing similar transition difficulties. His support reinforced my confidence in the decision, while acknowledging the complexity of leaving established relationships and community connections. Mrs. Chen's reaction was characteristically practical and supportive. She expressed pride in my achievement while immediately beginning to discuss timelines and logistics for apartment transition. Her matter-of-fact response to my success contrasted sharply with my family's typical reaction to my career developments, highlighting the difference between relationships based on acceptance versus those dependent on meeting specific expectations. The community center director was both congratulatory and disappointed, recognizing that my departure would affect their veteran support programs while understanding my need for career advancement. She asked whether I would be willing to help identify and train a replacement volunteer, ensuring continuity for the financial literacy classes that had become increasingly popular among local veterans and their families. Each of these conversations reinforced my confidence in accepting the San Diego position while highlighting the genuine support and appreciation I'd found outside my family relationships. The contrast was stark. People who knew me primarily through my work and community involvement recognized my capabilities and celebrated my success, while family members who had known me longest seemed least able to appreciate my achievements or potential. Informing my family about the job offer required careful consideration of timing and approach. The confrontation on Christmas Eve had created ongoing tension that made normal communication difficult, while my absence from family activities since then had generated additional concern and criticism. I decided to call my father first, recognizing that he had been most supportive during the immediate aftermath of the holiday argument. My father's response to the news was complex, combining genuine pleasure at my career advancement with concern about my decision to relocate away from family and establish support systems. He asked detailed questions about the position, the organization, and my long-term career goals, demonstrating more interest in my professional development than I had experienced from family members in years. His reaction suggested that he understood the significance of the opportunity, even if he regretted the geographic distance it would create. When I explained that Admiral Harrison had recommended me for the position based on his research into my military service record, my father's surprise was evident. He acknowledged that the family had never fully understood the details of my naval career or the level of responsibility I'd held during service. This admission revealed that their criticism of my transition struggles had been based on incomplete information about my military achievements and the value of my service experience. The conversation with my father provided hope that family relationships might improve over time, as my professional success became more apparent, and as distance reduced the daily friction created by different lifestyle choices and financial circumstances. He promised to share the news with my mother and David, suggesting that he would emphasize the positive aspects of the opportunity while addressing concerns about relocation privately. David called that evening with questions about the position that revealed both professional interest and personal surprise at my career advancement. As a lawyer, he understood the complexity and responsibility involved in managing logistics operations for a major military installation. His questions about salary, benefits, and advancement opportunities suggested recognition that this position represented significant professional achievement rather than merely another job change. More importantly, David's conversation included an acknowledgement that the family's assessment of my post-military career prospects had been based on limited understanding of how military skills could translate into civilian opportunities. He expressed regret about the Christmas Eve confrontation and his mother's harsh criticism, recognizing that their lack of information about my service record had influenced their perception of my capabilities and potential. My mother's call came 2 days later, her tone careful and somewhat formal as she processed news that contradicted many of the assumptions underlying her Christmas Eve criticism. She asked fewer questions about the technical aspects of the position, focusing instead on practical concerns about relocation, living arrangements, and maintaining family relationships across greater geographic distance. Her approach suggested that she was struggling to reconcile this professional opportunity with her previous assessment of my choices and prospects. The conversation was shorter and less emotionally charged than our recent interactions, but it revealed the challenge my mother faced in adjusting her perception of my capabilities and achievements. The job offer provided external validation of my professional value that contradicted her belief that my military service had been largely irrelevant to civilian career success. Her struggle to process this information was evident in her careful choice of words and avoidance of direct commentary on the position's significance. Despite the measured tone of family conversations about my career opportunity, I sensed underlying skepticism about my ability to succeed in such a responsible position. Years of viewing me as the family member who struggled with conventional success had created expectations that were difficult to adjust quickly. The job offer challenged their fundamental assumptions about my capabilities, while forcing them to acknowledge that their understanding of my military service had been incomplete. As I prepared for relocation to San Diego, I reflected on the transformation that had occurred since Christmas Eve. The family confrontation that had felt so devastating at the time had ultimately created space for opportunities and relationships that valued my military experience and professional capabilities. Admiral Harrison's recognition of my achievements had provided validation that enabled me to pursue career advancement with confidence rather than desperation. The contrast between family criticism and professional recognition revealed important truths about the nature of support and validation. Family relationships, despite their emotional significance, were not necessarily the most reliable source of accurate assessment about capabilities and potential. Professional colleagues who understood military service and its value in civilian contexts were better positioned to recognize my qualifications and recommend appropriate opportunities. More significantly, the experience taught me that seeking approval from people who couldn't appreciate my military service was both futile and potentially damaging to my career development. Family members who viewed my naval service as a detour from real life were unlikely to recognize opportunities that built on that foundation, regardless of their genuinely good intentions and desire for my success. The relocation to San Diego proceeded smoothly, with the Navy's Civilian Personnel Office providing comprehensive support for the transition. Within 3 weeks, I'd secured a modest apartment near the base, transferred my professional credentials, and completed the security clearance updates required for the logistics coordinator position. The efficiency of the process stood in stark contrast to my previous job searches, where applications disappeared into automated systems and responses were rare or dismissive. My first week at Naval Base San Diego confirmed that Admiral Harrison's description of the position had been accurate but understated. The logistics coordinator role involved oversight of supply operations that spanned multiple time zones and affected thousands of personnel across Pacific Fleet installations. The responsibility was significant, but it felt familiar rather than overwhelming, building directly on systems and processes I'd managed during my active duty service. The team I joined consisted of experienced professionals who appreciated military background and understood the complexity of naval logistics operations. My supervisor, Captain Sarah Mitchell, was a former Navy officer who had transitioned to civilian leadership within the defense contractor community. Her approach to management emphasized collaboration and innovation, encouraging team members to propose improvements based on their operational experience and technical expertise. Captain Mitchell's leadership style provided the professional development I'd been seeking since leaving active duty. During our initial meeting, she outlined expectations that went far beyond routine task completion. She wanted me to analyze existing procedures, identify inefficiencies, and develop recommendations for operational improvements that could enhance both cost effectiveness and mission capability. The assignment required exactly the kind of systems thinking and analytical skills that had characterized my most successful military projects. The work environment at Naval Base San Diego offered something I hadn't experienced in civilian employment: genuine respect for military service combined with clear expectations for professional excellence. Colleagues understood the value of military training without making assumptions about personality or capability based on service background. The atmosphere was collaborative and mission-focused, emphasizing results rather than credentials or conventional career progression. Within my first month, I identified several procurement inefficiencies that were creating unnecessary delays and cost overruns in critical supply operations. The problems weren't obvious from individual transaction records, but they became apparent when I applied analytical techniques I'd developed during my naval service to examine patterns across multiple vendors and delivery schedules. My recommendations for addressing these issues drew directly on my military experience, while proposing innovations that could improve both operational efficiency and budget management. Captain Mitchell's response to my initial analysis exceeded my expectations. She not only implemented my recommendations but also requested a comprehensive review of logistics procedures across the entire command. The expanded assignment represented both professional recognition and opportunity for significant impact on operations that affected thousands of personnel. More importantly, it demonstrated that my military experience was valued as a foundation for continued professional growth, rather than simply relevant background. The financial stability provided by the position allowed me to pursue interests and activities that had been impossible during my months of part-time employment in Riverside. I enrolled in professional development courses related to supply chain management and logistics technology, expanding my expertise in areas that complemented my military background. The investment in continued learning felt both personally satisfying and professionally strategic, positioning me for advancement within the defense logistics community. I also began volunteering with veteran support organizations in the San Diego area, particularly groups that helped transitioning service members navigate civilian employment challenges. My own experience of struggle and eventual success provided credibility and insight that proved valuable in mentoring other veterans facing similar difficulties. The work was personally meaningful while contributing to a community that understood and appreciated military service. 6 weeks into my new position, I received an unexpected call from David. His tone was different from our recent conversations, less patronizing, and more genuinely curious about my professional experience. He explained that his law firm was considering expansion into defense contracting work, and he wanted my perspective on the industry and potential opportunities for legal services within the military logistics community. The conversation revealed that David had been researching my new position and its significance within naval operations. His questions demonstrated understanding that my role involved substantial responsibility and technical expertise, contradicting his previous assumption that my post-military career struggles reflected limited capabilities rather than inadequate civilian opportunities. The shift in his perspective was subtle but unmistakable, suggesting recognition that military experience could translate into meaningful professional success when properly matched with appropriate positions. More significantly, David acknowledged that the family's criticism of my career choices had been based on incomplete information about both my military achievements and the value of veteran skills in civilian employment markets. He expressed regret about the Christmas Eve confrontation and his mother's harsh assessment of my impact on family dynamics. While stopping short of a full apology, his comments suggested awareness that their lack of understanding about military service had influenced their perception of my struggles and potential. 2 months after starting my position at Naval Base San Diego, I received notice that my comprehensive review of logistics procedures had been selected for presentation at a Defense Department conference on supply chain innovation. The invitation to present my findings to senior officials from multiple military branches represented significant professional recognition and opportunity to influence broader policy discussions about veteran employment in defense-related civilian positions. Preparing for the conference presentation required synthesizing complex technical information into recommendations that could be understood and implemented by leaders without detailed logistics background. The challenge drew on communication skills I'd developed during military briefings, while requiring adaptation to civilian policy environments. Captain Mitchell provided guidance and support throughout the preparation process, emphasizing that successful presentation could establish my reputation within the broader defense logistics community. The conference took place in Washington, D.C., attended by senior officials from the Department of Defense, major defense contractors, and academic researchers studying military logistics challenges. My presentation focused on the value of veteran experience in identifying and solving complex operational problems, using my own analysis of procurement inefficiencies as a case study for how military training could enhance civilian defense operations. The response to my presentation exceeded all expectations. Multiple senior officials approached me afterward to discuss potential collaboration on similar projects, while several defense contractors expressed interest in consulting arrangements that could utilize my expertise on veteran employment and logistics optimization. The professional recognition provided validation that my military service had genuine value in civilian contexts when properly understood and utilized. Admiral Harrison attended the conference and approached me after my presentation with obvious pride and satisfaction. He explained that my success had validated his assessment of veteran potential, while demonstrating the effectiveness of programs designed to recruit experienced military personnel into appropriate civilian positions. His support had been instrumental in my career transition, but my subsequent achievements had proven that his confidence was well-founded. During our conversation, Admiral Harrison mentioned that my family had contacted him recently, seeking information about my professional activities and achievements. Apparently, news of my conference presentation and growing reputation within defense logistics circles had reached them through mutual connections, prompting questions about the significance of my work and its potential for continued advancement. The idea that my family was now seeking external validation of my professional success struck me as both ironic and predictable. After years of criticism based on their limited understanding of military service and its civilian applications, they were now turning to Admiral Harrison for expert assessment of achievements they couldn't evaluate independently. Their inquiry suggested recognition that their previous judgment had been incomplete, but it also revealed their continued need for external authority to validate my worth. 3 months after the Washington conference, I was offered a promotion to Senior Logistics Coordinator with expanded responsibilities for Pacific Fleet Supply operations. The position included oversight of multiple installations, coordination with international partners, and participation in strategic planning for future logistics capabilities. The salary increase was substantial, but more importantly, the role represented recognition that my contributions had genuine strategic value within naval operations. The promotion also came with an invitation to participate in a Pentagon working group developing recommendations for veteran employment in defense-related civilian positions. The assignment would involve travel to Washington for monthly meetings, while maintaining my primary responsibilities at Naval Base San Diego. The opportunity to influence policy discussions about veteran transition represented the kind of meaningful work I'd hoped to find when leaving active duty. I called my father to share news of the promotion, recognizing that he had been most supportive during my recent career transition. His response was immediate pride and excitement, demonstrating understanding that this advancement represented significant professional achievement rather than simply another job change. He asked detailed questions about my new responsibilities and their importance within naval operations, showing genuine interest in my work for the first time since my return from military service. During our conversation, my father revealed that the family had been discussing my career development extensively since learning about my conference presentation and growing professional reputation. My mother had expressed surprise and some embarrassment about her Christmas Eve criticism, recognizing that her assessment of my capabilities had been based on incomplete information about my military achievements and their civilian applications. David had apparently become something of an advocate for my professional success, explaining to family members the significance of my position and its requirements for technical expertise and leadership capability. His legal background helped him understand the complexity of defense contracting and the value of experienced personnel in managing large-scale logistics operations. His support represented a complete reversal from his previous assumption that my post-military struggles reflected personal limitations. 2 weeks later, my mother called with what she described as a long-overdue conversation about family relationships and mutual understanding. Her tone was careful and somewhat formal, but she acknowledged that the family's criticism of my career choices had been unfair and based on limited knowledge about military service and its civilian applications. She expressed regret about the Christmas Eve confrontation and its impact on our relationship. The conversation was emotionally complex, combining genuine remorse with subtle attempts to minimize the severity of previous criticism. My mother seemed to understand that her words had been hurtful, but she struggled to fully acknowledge the systematic nature of the family's dismissal of my military service and its value. Her apology felt incomplete, focused more on specific incidents than broader patterns of behavior. More significantly, my mother's call included an invitation to return for Easter Sunday dinner with the extended family. She explained that relatives had been asking about my career success and expressing interest in hearing about my work at Naval Base San Diego. The invitation felt like an attempt to restore normal family relationships while showcasing my achievements to relatives who had witnessed my previous struggles. I declined the Easter invitation politely but firmly, explaining that my work schedule and travel commitments made attendance difficult. The truth was more complex. I had no interest in returning to family gatherings, where my value was contingent on external validation of professional success. The relationships I'd built in San Diego, both professional and personal, were based on mutual respect and genuine appreciation for military service, rather than conditional acceptance dependent on meeting specific expectations. 6 months after starting my position at Naval Base San Diego, I received a call from Jennifer asking whether I would be willing to speak with Sophia about career options for young women interested in military service. Apparently, my 8-year-old niece had been asking questions about my work and expressing curiosity about Naval Academy admission requirements and military career opportunities. The request represented a fundamental shift in family dynamics. Instead of viewing my military service as a phase to overcome, they were now seeking my expertise and guidance for the next generation. Jennifer's tone was respectful and genuinely appreciative, acknowledging that my experience provided valuable perspective that other family members couldn't offer. I agreed to speak with Sophia during a video call, finding her questions both thoughtful and well-informed. She had researched naval operations online and understood that military service involved complex technical challenges and leadership responsibilities. Her interest seemed genuine rather than simply rebellious response to family expectations, suggesting that my example had demonstrated alternative paths to meaningful career success. The conversation with Sophia was personally rewarding while highlighting the broader impact of my career transition. My success in finding appropriate civilian employment had demonstrated that military service could lead to meaningful professional advancement when properly understood and utilized. More importantly, it had shown family members that their narrow definition of success had prevented them from recognizing alternative forms of achievement and contribution. A year after starting my position at Naval Base San Diego, I was selected for the Senior Executive Service Development Program, a fast-track advancement opportunity for high-potential civilian leaders within the Department of Defense. The program included advanced training in strategic planning, budget management, and policy development, preparing participants for senior leadership positions within defense organizations. The selection represented validation that my military service and subsequent civilian achievements had established me as a recognized leader within the defense logistics community. The opportunity for continued advancement eliminated any remaining concerns about long-term career prospects, while providing pathways to influence policy discussions about veteran employment and military logistics capabilities. Admiral Harrison called to congratulate me on the selection, noting that my success had exceeded even his optimistic expectations when he first recommended me for the logistics coordinator position. He mentioned that my case study was now being used in presentations about veteran employment potential, demonstrating how appropriate matching of military skills with civilian opportunities could benefit both individuals and organizations. During our conversation, Admiral Harrison revealed that my family had contacted him again recently, this time to express gratitude for his role in my career development. Apparently, they had begun to understand that his recognition of my military achievements had been based on factual assessment rather than personal kindness, and they wanted to acknowledge their previous failure to appreciate my service record and its civilian applications. The family's belated recognition of my achievements felt less satisfying than I had expected during the difficult months after Christmas Eve. The validation I'd sought from them had been replaced by professional recognition and personal relationships based on mutual respect rather than conditional acceptance. Their approval was no longer necessary for my self-confidence or career advancement. I established a scholarship fund in my grandmother's memory, providing financial support for children of military families pursuing higher education or technical training. The fund focused particularly on students whose career interests didn't align with conventional expectations, recognizing that alternative paths could lead to meaningful success when properly supported and developed. The scholarship recipients included children interested in military service, technical trades, and other careers that family members might view as unconventional or risky. My own experience had taught me that family disapproval didn't necessarily indicate poor career choices, while external validation could come from professional communities that understood and appreciated specific skills and interests. 2 years after leaving Riverside, I returned for a brief visit to see Mrs. Chen and Frank Kowalski, the people who had supported me during my most difficult period. Both expressed pride in my career advancement while emphasizing that my success had been evident even during my struggles with part-time employment. Their consistent faith in my capabilities had provided crucial support when family criticism threatened to undermine my self-confidence. The visit reminded me that meaningful relationships were based on acceptance and mutual respect, rather than conditional approval dependent on meeting specific expectations. Mrs. Chen and Frank had valued my reliability and character during difficult months when family members focused primarily on my apparent failure to achieve conventional success. Their support had been unconditional and invaluable. I chose not to visit my family during the Riverside trip, recognizing that our relationships remained complicated despite their recent acknowledgement of my professional achievements. The geographic and emotional distance had been beneficial for both sides, allowing me to build confidence and success while giving them time to adjust their perceptions and expectations. The Christmas following my second year in San Diego, I hosted a dinner for military families who couldn't travel home for the holidays. The gathering included both active duty personnel and veterans, creating community for people who understood the challenges and rewards of military service. The tradition became an annual event that provided meaningful connection during holidays that could otherwise feel isolating for service members far from family. My phone rang that Christmas Eve with calls from family members wishing me well and expressing hope that we could rebuild relationships on a foundation of mutual understanding and respect. The conversations were pleasant but carefully limited, acknowledging past difficulties while avoiding detailed discussion of ongoing differences in values and priorities. 3 years after the Christmas Eve confrontation that had felt so devastating, I realized that my family's rejection had ultimately been a gift. Their inability to appreciate my military service and their narrow definition of success had forced me to seek validation and opportunities outside their approval. The path had been difficult, but it had led to professional fulfillment and personal relationships based on genuine appreciation, rather than conditional acceptance. The position at Naval Base San Diego had evolved into exactly the kind of meaningful career I'd hoped to find when leaving active duty. The work was challenging and important, utilizing my military experience while providing opportunities for continued growth and advancement. More significantly, it had connected me with professional communities that valued veteran skills and understood the unique perspective that military service provided. Looking back on the family confrontation that had seemed so painful at the time, I understood that their criticism had been based on their own limitations rather than my failures. Their inability to recognize the value of military service or appreciate alternative definitions of success had created problems for them as much as for me. My subsequent achievements had forced them to acknowledge that their assessment had been incomplete and unfair. The lesson wasn't about proving family wrong or achieving success despite their lack of support. It was about recognizing that validation from people who couldn't appreciate your strongest qualities was ultimately meaningless and potentially destructive. Professional communities and personal relationships based on mutual respect provided more reliable sources of support and accurate assessment of capabilities and potential. 5 years after Admiral Harrison first recognized my military achievements and recommended me for the logistics coordinator position, I was promoted to Deputy Director of Pacific Fleet Logistics, overseeing supply operations for the Navy's largest operational command. The position represented the culmination of a career path that had seemed impossible during my months of struggle in Riverside, but which had developed naturally once my military experience was properly understood and utilized. The success felt earned rather than lucky, built on skills and experience that had always been valuable but had taken time to find appropriate application in civilian contexts. Admiral Harrison's recognition had provided the crucial opportunity, but my subsequent achievements had proven that his confidence was well-founded and his assessment accurate. My family relationships had stabilized at a respectful distance, with occasional communication and acknowledgement of mutual care despite fundamental differences in values and priorities. They had learned to appreciate my achievements without fully understanding the path that had led to them, while I had found peace with their limitations, without requiring their approval for my choices. The young veterans I mentored often asked about family relationships and the challenge of maintaining connections with people who couldn't understand or appreciate military service. My advice was always the same. Seek validation from communities that understand your experience and value your contributions, while recognizing that family love doesn't always translate into accurate assessment of your capabilities or appropriate support for your goals. The Christmas Eve confrontation that had once felt like devastating rejection had ultimately become the catalyst for discovering my true potential and finding professional communities that valued my military service. The pain had been real, but it had led to opportunities and relationships that provided genuine fulfillment rather than conditional acceptance. Sometimes the greatest gift comes disguised as loss, forcing you to discover strength you didn't know you possessed, and seek recognition from people who actually understand your worth. The promotion to Deputy Director of Pacific Fleet Logistics came with an unexpected assignment that would bring everything full circle. The Secretary of the Navy had requested a comprehensive study on veteran transition challenges and their impact on national defense capabilities. The project would involve analyzing successful integration programs while developing recommendations for improving civilian employment outcomes for transitioning service members. Leading this initiative meant returning to the very questions that had defined my own struggle after leaving active duty. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was now positioned to influence policy discussions about problems I had experienced firsthand just 5 years earlier. The research would require extensive travel, interviews with veterans across multiple career stages, and collaboration with civilian employers who had successfully integrated military talent into their organizations. The first phase of the study took me to transition assistance programs at military installations across the country. I interviewed hundreds of service members preparing to leave active duty, listening to their concerns about civilian employment prospects and their understanding of how military skills might translate into civilian career opportunities. The conversations revealed patterns that mirrored my own experience. Talented, experienced leaders who struggled to articulate their value in civilian terms. One interview particularly resonated with my own journey. A Navy logistics specialist with 8 years of experience managing supply operations for overseas deployments was preparing to separate from service without any clear career direction. Her skills in budget management, personnel supervision, and complex problem-solving were extensive, but she couldn't identify civilian positions that would utilize her expertise effectively. The civilian career counselors at her installation focused primarily on translating military job titles into civilian equivalents, rather than understanding the depth and complexity of her actual responsibilities. This specialist's situation reminded me of my own confusion after leaving the Navy, when well-meaning family members and employment counselors suggested entry-level positions that ignored my leadership experience and technical expertise. The disconnect between military achievements and civilian recognition wasn't unique to my experience, but represented a systemic failure to understand and utilize veteran capabilities appropriately. The second phase of research involved visiting organizations that had successfully integrated veteran talent into leadership positions. These companies and government agencies had developed recruitment and onboarding processes specifically designed to identify and utilize military experience effectively. Their approaches contrasted sharply with traditional hiring practices that often overlooked or undervalued veteran qualifications. One particularly successful program, operated by a major logistics company, actively recruited former military personnel for management positions that built directly on their service experience. The company's executives understood that military logistics training provided exactly the skills needed for civilian supply chain management, while military leadership experience translated directly into effective team management and crisis response capabilities. The hiring manager explained that veterans consistently outperformed other candidates in roles requiring systematic thinking, decision-making under pressure, and team coordination across complex organizations. Rather than viewing military service as simply relevant background, the company treated it as premium qualification that provided competitive advantage in challenging operational environments. This approach aligned with Admiral Harrison's original assessment of my qualifications and his recognition that military experience could provide exceptional value in civilian contexts when properly understood and utilized. The successful integration programs I studied all shared this fundamental insight. Veteran skills weren't just transferable, but often superior to conventional civilian training for specific types of challenging work. The research also included extensive analysis of veteran employment outcomes across different industries and geographic regions. The data revealed significant disparities in success rates depending on local understanding of military service and availability of employers who actively valued veteran experience. Areas with strong military presence or defense-related industries showed consistently better outcomes than regions where military service was less common or understood. These findings had important implications for policy development and program design. Effective veteran transition required not just individual preparation but also community education about military training and its civilian applications. Employers needed support in understanding how to evaluate veteran qualifications and integrate military personnel into civilian organizational cultures. 6 months into the research project, I was invited to testify before a congressional subcommittee examining veteran employment challenges and their impact on military recruitment and retention. The opportunity to present findings directly to policymakers represented both professional recognition and chance to influence legislation that could affect thousands of transitioning service members. Preparing for the testimony required synthesizing complex research findings into clear recommendations that legislators could understand and implement. The challenge was similar to military briefings but with higher stakes and broader audience, requiring communication skills that built on my military training while adapting to civilian political environments. The testimony focused on 3 key recommendations derived from my research. First, transition assistance programs needed fundamental restructuring to emphasize skills translation rather than job title conversion. Second, civilian employers required education and incentives to recognize and utilize veteran qualifications effectively. Third, geographic mobility support was essential for connecting veterans with appropriate opportunities in regions where their skills were valued. The subcommittee's response exceeded my expectations, with both Democratic and Republican members expressing interest in bipartisan legislation that could address systemic barriers to veteran employment. Several legislators shared personal stories about family members or constituents who had struggled with military transition despite impressive service records and obvious capabilities. Following the congressional testimony, I received invitations to speak at conferences, contribute to academic publications, and consult with organizations developing veteran recruitment programs. The professional recognition felt both gratifying and surreal, considering that just 5 years earlier I had been struggling to find part-time employment that covered basic expenses. The contrast between my current professional standing and my family's previous assessment of my potential created complex emotions. Part of me felt vindicated by external recognition that contradicted their earlier criticism, while another part recognized that seeking their validation had been fundamentally misguided from the beginning. My worth and capabilities hadn't changed, only the context and audience for evaluation had shifted. During this period of intensive travel and professional engagement, I maintained minimal contact with my family. Occasional text messages and brief phone calls provided basic updates about health and major life events, but we avoided substantive discussions about career developments or personal relationships. The distance felt comfortable rather than strained, allowing focus on work and community that genuinely valued my contributions. The scholarship fund I had established in my grandmother's memory had grown substantially through donations from defense contractors and veteran organizations that appreciated my research work. The fund now supported dozens of students whose career interests didn't align with family expectations, providing both financial assistance and mentorship for young people pursuing alternative paths to meaningful success. One scholarship recipient particularly reminded me of my younger self. Sarah Chen, daughter of a career military family, wanted to pursue aerospace engineering despite her parents' preference for medical or legal careers. Her application essay described feeling like a disappointment for choosing technical training over traditional professional education, despite her obvious aptitude and passion for aircraft design. Through the scholarship program, I was able to connect Sarah with aerospace professionals who appreciated her military family background and understood how that experience could enhance her engineering career. The mentorship relationship that developed provided her with support and validation that her family couldn't offer, while giving me opportunity to prevent another talented young person from experiencing the isolation and self-doubt that had characterized my own transition. 2 years after beginning the Veteran Employment Research Project, I was invited to present findings at the Pentagon to senior leaders from all military branches. The presentation would influence policy decisions affecting millions of service members and veterans, representing the culmination of work that had begun with my own difficult transition experience. The Pentagon briefing room was filled with flag officers, senior civilian officials, and policy experts who would determine how the military services approached transition assistance and veteran employment support. The audience included Admiral Harrison, now serving as Director of Naval Personnel, whose early recognition of my potential had made this moment possible. The presentation covered comprehensive findings about veteran employment challenges, successful integration programs, and policy recommendations for improving transition outcomes. The data was compelling, but more importantly, the recommendations were based on real understanding of both military experience and civilian employment markets, rather than theoretical assumptions about skills translation. The response from senior leadership was immediate and enthusiastic. Several flag officers acknowledged that their own services had struggled with transition assistance programs that failed to adequately prepare personnel for civilian employment or connect them with appropriate opportunities. The research provided evidence-based guidance for improving these programs while demonstrating their strategic importance for military recruitment and retention. Following the Pentagon presentation, the Secretary of Defense announced a comprehensive initiative to restructure transition assistance programs based on my research recommendations. The policy changes would affect every service member leaving active duty, potentially improving employment outcomes for hundreds of thousands of veterans over the coming decades. The announcement represented professional achievement beyond anything I had imagined possible during my months of struggle in Riverside. The work had evolved from personal necessity into national policy, transforming individual experience into systemic improvement that could benefit future generations of veterans facing similar challenges. Admiral Harrison approached me after the Pentagon presentation with obvious pride and satisfaction. He mentioned that my success had exceeded even his optimistic projections when he first recommended me for the logistics coordinator position 5 years earlier. More importantly, he emphasized that my achievements had validated his assessment of veteran potential while demonstrating the importance of appropriate opportunity identification and support. During our conversation, Admiral Harrison revealed that my family had been following my career developments through mutual connections and media coverage of my research work. Apparently, they had begun to understand that their Christmas Eve assessment of my impact on family dynamics had been fundamentally misguided. based on incomplete information about my capabilities and potential contributions. The idea that my family was now proud of achievements they had once predicted were impossible felt less significant than it might have years earlier. Their approval was no longer necessary for my self-confidence or professional advancement, while their previous criticism had lost its power to cause emotional distress or self-doubt. 3 months after the Pentagon presentation, I received an unexpected call from my mother. Her tone was different from our recent conversations, less careful and more genuinely emotional, as she attempted to address the damage caused by years of misunderstanding and inadequate support. She acknowledged that the family's criticism of my career choices had been based on their own limitations rather than my failures, recognizing that their narrow definition of success had prevented them from appreciating alternative forms of achievement and contribution. The conversation included explicit apology for the Christmas Eve confrontation and acknowledgement that their assessment had been both hurtful and inaccurate. More significantly, my mother expressed regret about the pattern of dismissal and criticism that had characterized their response to my military service and civilian transition. She recognized that their lack of understanding about military training and its value had influenced their perception of my struggles and potential, creating additional barriers during an already challenging period. The apology felt genuine but incomplete, addressing specific incidents rather than acknowledging the systematic nature of their failure to provide appropriate support and recognition. More importantly, it came only after external validation had forced them to reconsider their assessment, suggesting that their change in perspective was reactive rather than based on genuine understanding of their previous mistakes. I accepted the apology graciously while maintaining emotional distance that had proven essential for my professional development and personal well-being. The conversation provided closure for past conflicts without creating expectations for dramatically improved future relationships, recognizing that fundamental differences in values and priorities would likely persist. 6 months later, I was offered the position of Director of Veteran Employment Policy at the Department of Veterans Affairs, a newly created role that would involve implementing the research recommendations across all federal agencies while coordinating with private sector partners to improve veteran employment outcomes nationwide. The position represented the pinnacle of career advancement in veteran advocacy and employment policy, utilizing both my military experience and civilian expertise, while providing opportunity to influence programs affecting millions of former service members. The role would involve regular interaction with senior government officials, corporate executives, and veteran organization leaders, requiring diplomatic skills and policy expertise that built on my military training, while extending far beyond my original logistics background. Accepting the Veterans Affairs position meant relocating to Washington, D.C., further increasing geographic distance from family, while positioning me at the center of national discussions about veteran issues and military transition challenges. The opportunity felt like natural progression of work that had begun with my own difficult transition experience and evolved into comprehensive policy development. The day I accepted the Veterans Affairs position, I received a congratulatory call from Admiral Harrison expressing both personal pride and professional satisfaction at my continued advancement. He mentioned that my career trajectory had become a case study for veteran transition success, demonstrating how appropriate recognition and opportunity could unlock potential that traditional hiring practices often failed to identify. During our conversation, Admiral Harrison revealed that he had been approached by business schools and policy institutes, requesting interviews about his role in my career development. The requests reflected growing academic interest in veteran employment challenges and successful integration strategies, with my experience serving as example of how military leaders could identify and support transitioning personnel effectively. The academic attention felt both flattering and slightly uncomfortable, transforming personal struggle into research subject and policy case study. However, the visibility also provided opportunity to influence broader discussions about veteran transition, while demonstrating that individual success stories could inform systemic improvements benefiting entire communities. 1 year into the Veterans Affairs position, I was invited to deliver the keynote address at the annual Veterans Day celebration at my former installation in San Diego. The invitation provided opportunity to return to the place where my civilian career had begun, while addressing current service members facing their own transition decisions. The speech focused on the importance of understanding military experience as foundation for continued growth, rather than simply relevant background for civilian employment. I emphasized that successful transition required both individual preparation and community support, while acknowledging that finding appropriate opportunities often involved geographic mobility and willingness to seek recognition from employers who understood military training and its applications. The audience included both current service members and veterans at various career stages, providing diverse perspectives on transition challenges and employment outcomes. The questions following my presentation revealed ongoing concerns about skills translation, geographic limitations, and family expectations that mirrored my own experience while highlighting the continued relevance of research findings and policy recommendations. After the Veterans Day ceremony, I visited the logistics office where my civilian career had begun 5 years earlier. Captain Mitchell, now promoted to senior director, expressed pride in my advancement, while acknowledging that my early success had exceeded everyone's expectations for rapid career development and policy influence. The conversation with Captain Mitchell provided perspective on the transformation that had occurred since my arrival at Naval Base San Diego. The shy, uncertain veteran who had struggled with part-time employment in Riverside had evolved into a confident policy leader whose work influenced national discussions about military transition and veteran employment. The change hadn't been simply professional advancement, but fundamental personal growth that enabled effective leadership and policy development. The challenging months after leaving active duty had provided essential experience that informed my understanding of veteran transition while developing resilience and perspective that proved valuable in high-pressure policy environments. 5 years after the Christmas Eve confrontation that had seemed so devastating, I found myself in a position to influence policies affecting millions of veterans, while building community among people who understood and appreciated military service. The path had been difficult, but it had led to professional fulfillment and personal relationships based on genuine mutual respect rather than conditional acceptance. The lesson learned wasn't about proving family wrong or achieving success despite their lack of support, but about recognizing that validation from people who couldn't appreciate your strongest qualities was ultimately meaningless and potentially destructive. Professional communities and personal relationships based on shared values and mutual understanding provided more reliable sources of support and accurate assessment of capabilities and potential. During my final interview for this story, conducted in my Pentagon office overlooking the Potomac River, I reflected on the journey from family rejection to national policy leadership. The Christmas Eve confrontation had forced me to seek validation and opportunities outside family approval, ultimately leading to professional fulfillment that would have been impossible if I had remained dependent on their narrow definition of success. The geographic and emotional distance from family had been essential for discovering my true potential and building confidence in my capabilities and judgment. While relationships had eventually stabilized at respectful distance, the period of separation had allowed growth and development that might not have occurred within the constraints of family expectations and limitations. My advice to veterans facing family criticism or lack of support remained consistent. Seek validation from communities that understand your experience and value your contributions, while recognizing that family love doesn't always translate into accurate assessment of your capabilities or appropriate support for your goals. Sometimes the greatest growth comes from stepping outside familiar relationships and finding your worth reflected in the recognition of strangers who become allies and colleagues. The young veterans I continued to mentor often asked whether family relationships had been permanently damaged by my career choices and geographic mobility. The honest answer was complex. Relationships had been fundamentally changed by mutual recognition of limitations and boundaries, but they had also been freed from the toxic patterns of criticism and conditional acceptance that had characterized earlier interactions. My family had learned to appreciate my achievements without fully understanding the path that had led to them, while I had found peace with their limitations without requiring their approval for my choices. The relationships that mattered most were now based on mutual respect and shared values, rather than blood relationships and historical connections that might not translate into genuine understanding or support. The Christmas Eve, that had once felt like devastating rejection, had ultimately become the catalyst for discovering strength I didn't know I possessed, and finding recognition from people who actually understood my worth. Sometimes the most painful moments create the space for transformation that leads to fulfillment beyond anything previously imagined possible. Looking back from my current position as a senior policy leader whose work influences national discussions about veteran transition and employment, I understood that my family's inability to appreciate my military service had been their loss rather than my failure. Their narrow definition of success had prevented them from recognizing the exact qualities that made me valuable in professional environments, where military experience was properly understood and utilized. The story that began with family rejection had evolved into national recognition and policy influence that improved opportunities for hundreds of thousands of veterans facing similar challenges. The pain had been real and the struggle had been difficult, but both had been necessary for developing the perspective and resilience that enabled effective leadership in complex policy environments. Admiral Harrison's early recognition of my potential had provided the crucial opportunity that changed everything, but my subsequent achievements had proven that his confidence was well-founded and his assessment accurate. The success felt earned rather than lucky, built on skills and experience that had always been valuable but had required appropriate context and community for full expression and recognition. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.